Hey everybody, welcome now to the 9th lesson within the Stylized Game Weapons class. In the last lesson we went ahead and baked out our normal map and ambient occlusion maps within XNormal, and then we also did the finishing touches on the model to make sure that it was ready to export into 3DCoat. Again, try to make sure that the mesh you'll be importing is completely mirrored over, that you've triangulated it if needed, and that all aspects of the mesh are duplicated and merged if needed, such as the handle wrap right here in this weapon. Also, make sure that the ambient occlusion and normal map are saved out as targas at 24 bits. Then, in Maya, all you really need to do is make sure that everything is combined, and then basically go to export selection and export it as an OBJ. Once you've exported it as an OBJ, we will then open up 3DCoat. And with 3DCoat opened up, you can just I usually click out of this right away. I go to File, Import, Model for per pixel painting, and then I click on what we basically just exported out of Maya, which is the final mesh that is ready to start painting on top. So I'm going to go ahead and import this in. Now for these options, this is what will default come up. But we want to make sure that for UV map typing, we definitely have keep UVs on. But for texture width and texture height, we want to change this to 2K. We want to change this to 2048 because when we baked out our maps, we had this at 2048. So we hit OK, and then this will load up in about a second. There we go. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that similarly in previous lessons, I have this background image as the concept. To set this up in 3DCoat, what you do is you click on this camera drop-down up here, click on it, then go to background, then click on choose background image. And now you'll notice actually, for instance, the background image that I used is this image right here. You'll notice that it is a little skewed. Like I had to recrop it and reposition it in order for it to basically be centered and aligned somewhat correctly within 3DCoat. So just be aware of that. If you already made an image plane for your concept, you might have to move it around a little bit or recrop it a little bit if you want to kind of be more so in the middle within 3DCoat. But I would recommend doing this because especially as you're sort of making the color map, when you're trying to select all the colors, glaze in the colors, it's kind of nice just to have the colors literally right behind you for you to reference while you're painting this model. A couple other settings, I always tend to turn off the grid, so it's just this icon right here. I have the ambient light intensity at 40, and I have the primary light intensity at 14. I'll also usually kind of change the angle of lighting a little bit just to make it a little more dynamic, and it'll be a little more obvious once I put the other maps in. But that is basically all we need to do is kind of set it up, to set 3DCoat up. Next, we then just gotta go ahead and start importing in all of the different textures. So I'm going to go to Textures, Import, and now I'm going to import in that diffuse map that we saved out as a target. So I'm going to go to Diffuse Map, select Mystic Step the occlusion, because at this point we're really just bringing in the ambient occlusion that we baked out in XNormal. So I'm going to load that in. It'll load up everywhere. And then I'm also going to go ahead and load in the normal map. We go to Normal Map, select the normals. And for this, because in XNormal we had positive for all the different channels and we had it as default, we don't want to invert or swap anything. Just keep it all unchecked. Hit OK, and that will load up. So we're basically ready to start painting on this, but one thing that you'll notice, at least here in my model, is that for these tips down here in the bottom right and the top right stone, there's something a little odd going on. But when I look at both the ambient occlusion and a normal map, you don't see anything wrong. And then the other thing is when I go into Marmoset, and actually I'm going to load up, just the ambient occlusion, you'll notice that there's no issue there as well. And I've also checked this out in Unreal, so this issue isn't recurring elsewhere. So if you have something kind of similar, where there's this kind of oddity kind of going on once you load up the normal map, but you don't see any issue within the normal map, the ambient occlusion map, or when you check it in the Marmoset, then you're fine. You can kind of just ignore it. And again, also, I will be going over how to import your mesh in Marmoset and how to kind of set that up in a couple of lessons. But If you're having any issues, it's a good idea to kind of check it in Marmoset first, actually, before you start painting in the diffuse map. But for now, I'll kind of just show you what the process is for painting the color map. Alrighty. So now for this, what I'm first going to do before I actually start like glazing in colors is I want to refine the values. I want to really make sure that all the forms are accentuated and everything like that. So what I might do is I'm going to go ahead and, this is an empty layer, I'm going to set this layer to multiply. I'm going to pull this out so it's a little more obvious. But I'm going to change the layer blending mode right here to standard, from standard blend to multiply. I'm going to go ahead and bring this down a little bit, about so. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my color opacity, I always like to work with this at 100. There's some instances where I'll change it, but for the most part I always keep it at 100. It usually will alter the opacity of a layer instead. Now what I want to do first is I want to basically establish all of the local values. I want to establish the value relationships between all these different elements, such as this darker stone base and this lighter stone or gem top part. But what I might do, just because in general this is fairly light, is I'm going to go ahead and click on the paint bucket tool right here. Bring down tool options. And with a really dark color selected and my multiply layer, I'm just going to do tool options layer. And what that will do is it will fill the entire layer with this color. So it'll give it a nice sort of really quick multiply. And what I might do is, maybe I want those stone pieces to remain fairly light, but I can still use this as a quick way to kind of establish a lot of the other values. So I can bring up the opacity a little bit, into about there. And then one thing I can do, because this might end up being quicker, is I can literally just kind of erase out. I want to make sure that I've got pen selected, paintbrush selected. Grab a little bit of a bigger brush. I can just really quickly kind of just erase that out. And again, I like to alternate between using this UV map window and just painting directly on the model. It kind of depends. There are going to be instances where you might not be able to see all the faces in the 3D viewer, such as some of these bottom capped edges. So you're going to have to go into the UV kind of window. But basically I can erase this out. So this can be a really quick way to kind of have everything else be darker. Set up that quick relationship. And then next what I tend to do is I'll refine the local values a little bit. So I'll make another multiply layer. Bring the opacity down a little bit. And maybe I want maybe I want this piece to be a little bit darker. And now in the concept that's not necessarily true, but I can now basically just start to block in this a little bit and start to darken this up a little bit more. Another thing is that at this point, we can start off actually with x-axis symmetry, because some of these elements are not only symmetrical along the z-axis, but also the x-axis. So I can either click on symmetry, and then click symmetry right here again, or I can hit S on the keyboard. And I want to make sure that I just click on x-axis. And now z-axis, that's not needed, because the way that we UV this, it's already going to be symmetrical along the z-axis, so that's not needed. I do like to go ahead and show symmetry plane, especially if I know I want to take this off eventually, because it sort of serves as a little bit of a reminder that eventually I want to take this off. So as you see here, going and putting this symmetry on will make this process go by quite a lot faster. Alright, so basically, once I've already set up the local values, which is really just, all I do is with a really dark color, the multiply layer, and with different layers, I just change the opacity. I'll kind of go back and forth with the slider to find, what is the actual value that I want. I'll kind of compare it against the concept. This is again nice for, this is another reason why it's nice to have the concept as a background. I can make multiple layers and kind of build up those local values. And then once those local values are established, what I do then is I start to accentuate some of these planes. So I'm going to make another layer. I'm going to go to multiply, bring down the opacity quite a bit. And now I'm just going to kind of go in here, start to really bring this out. Now, I know this is going to be a little too extreme. But what I tend to do is I tend to draw it out. Sometimes I'll draw it out at a higher opacity so I can really clearly see what I'm doing. Clearly really see, the marks I'm making, how precise they are. And once I've laid that in, I can again kind of use this slider to find more of an accurate value. I can do this all throughout here, like so. Kind of block that in. You can start to see how pretty quickly this is now starting to read a little bit better, more clear, and more dynamic from a distance. And really at this stage, at this value blocking stage, that's the main thing. Especially because this is a weapon, and it might not be that large on the screen all the time, I really just want to make sure that from a distance it has a good read that's not only dynamic, but it's got strong values, and it's really clear, it's very readable. So what I can do next, I can go back to symmetry, I can turn off the x-axis, and then I can start to just bring in some additional sort of values that help accentuate some of these planes. So, for instance, for these big cuts right here, again, I want to make sure that this value right here is very similar to this value. So I'm going to bring this down a bit, something like that. And a lot of this is like a little bit of trial and error. Kind of go back and forth, really kind of build up these layers a little bit. But if the layers ever get to a point where you've got all of a sudden way too many layers, it's really easy to take care of that. All you need to do, I'll show you that in a second, is hide the normal map on top for sure, and then go to Layers, Merge Visible. You definitely want to do that, merge all of the visible, because you're using multiply layers. And if you just merge it one at a time, it might kind of screw things up. And then you just bring back the normal map, and you're good to go. Then usually the next thing I do is I then start to really accentuate some of these cracks, these like lines, these crevices, like right along this line right here. I kind of make almost like an inking layer. So yeah, this is the new layer. Again, I use multiply. I use the multiply a lot for this stage. Almost completely only multiply, actually, usually. And then I just start to really accentuate this. So really, it kind of just feels like an inking layer. You just find what are those sort of separations that you really want to kind of delineate. It really helps to kind of put this where, maybe two materials are joining together to really make it clear that they're different. That's one way you can do. And then maybe I'll do not quite as intense. This is probably going to be way too dark, but I'll do a much lower opacity version there. But again, even in general, even for right here, I'll use the slider to kind of find a value that I think is more appropriate. The next thing I might do is I might then use gradients. So what I can do is, I'm going to show you this little bit of a further along version, but I can pull up, or you know what? It's going to be better off to show you how I then export this out into Photoshop if you ever need to make edits in Photoshop. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to go to Textures. First I'm going to go to Layers, Merge Visible again. I'm going to go Textures, Export, Diffuse Map. And I'm going to export this as diffuse values 01. And go and fill that in. I'm going to go File, Open, lesson 09, diffuse values 01. So now I've brought this into Photoshop. And say I want to do some general kind of gradients. Because if you look at this right here, this is kind of starting to come along together, but maybe it'll be nice to have some subtle gradients from, right along here going down, or a really light gradient from the top going down right here on the stone. And that sort of thing. I usually find that that's easier to do in Photoshop. So just as a really quick way of showing you how to do this, I usually use the polygonal tool. I really quickly kind of select out the space. Like maybe I just want to do this stone right here. Nothing else. What I can also do is I can make the original selection, use magic wand, and select out maybe these values right here. It's not mine to. Oh, wrong tool. There we go. Set out, deselect those values. That told me you can do it. Then basically, I just go to gradient. And then again, I can use a multiply layer. Actually, no. For this, yeah, I can do multiply. Bring that up a little bit. Down the opacity. And if I want to, I can also go ahead and do an overlay layer. Do basically white. Now start from the top and bring this down. And that's definitely way too intense. But I can bring down the opacity quite a bit. Something like that. So that's one way that you can get some nice gradients really quickly. I'm going to go ahead and deselect. I'm going to go ahead and layer merge visible. I'm going to resave this out. Let's use values 01. Might as well just kind of replace it. 24 bits. Go back into 3DCoat. Make a new layer. Textures. Import. Diffuse map. I'm going to go ahead and do this new one. And now I've got that gradient. So that's one way of making some nice gradients right away, especially for the values. But now I'm going to load up a version that has, at least for these other parts, it's been blocked in a little bit more with like the local values. So I'm going to go ahead and open. It is this version. Should load up in a second. Now in this version, I haven't done the gradients because you can also you can choose to do the gradients more so when you're starting to glaze in the color, or you can do it in the values. Like this could definitely benefit from a couple more gradients kind of up here. But you can see how fairly quickly, just by accentuating planes, you can have this thing read really well and pretty dynamic from a distance and have all the local values set up. And if I look at this now also in Marmoset, I can really quickly here in the color map, I can choose final values. And you can see that it looks pretty good already. And I haven't even added any of the colors, any gradients really, or anything like that. But this is also a really good stage to kind of do a quick check in something like Marmoset or Unreal when you've kind of maybe finalized the values before you start glazing the colors, just to see how in the final way that's going to be viewed, how is it looking and what other sort of changes you want to make. Like for instance, maybe from a distance, I'm liking like how a lot is reads, but I don't like how maybe I feel like these glyphs are being lost a little bit. So what I can do is I can go back to 3DCoat and I can really quickly start to accentuate this a little bit. And when I think about it, how am I going to make this more clear? There's a couple different ways I can do this. I can obviously make this more light. I can make this in general more dark. But what I kind of want to do is I might want to just accentuate this bevel right here, because this bevel is sort of like that last plane or that last shape before this material meets this material. So it's going to be a good opportunity to really sort of differentiate these two materials out a little bit. So I'm going to kind of use this plane as an opportunity to darken this up a little bit. And again, I'm going to use a slider to, here we go, find a value that I like. And I don't have x-axis symmetry on right now, so this is going to be carried over to the other side, which is actually going to work. It'll kind of give us a good sort of comparison right away. I'm just kind of doing this quickly. Definitely spend more time when you're doing this yourself. But now when I zoom out, you can see how now from a distance, that left side, it definitely reads better. And again, you can change the opacity a little bit, but yeah, that works. So now we're ready to start glazing some color and really making this model start to look more like the concept. So stay tuned to the next lesson where we will block in the colors with both overlay and color layer blending modes.